This video lecture for Risk Management 3008 is from CPCU Chapter 1 or Assignment 1 from the CPCU 500 text. It is an introduction to risk management. We'll begin with a discussion of understanding and quantifying risk, and then we'll discuss risk classifications, then financial consequences of risk, then 3 elements of loss exposures and types of exposures. Then we'll discuss risk management benefits, and we'll end with the risk management process. This lecture will set the stage for the remainder of the lectures for this course. So let's begin with understanding and quantifying risk. Risk can be defined as uncertainty regarding the possibility of future outcomes. While this definition is slightly different from what we discussed in Risk Management 2005, much of what we discuss here and in the rest of the lecture today was already discussed in the Principles of Risk and Insurance ARMIN 2005 course, so you'll need to lean on your knowledge from that course during this lecture today and throughout most of this course. There are basically 2 elements of the definition of risk I just gave you. They are uncertainty and possibility or probability. Let's look at them both more closely. First, let's discuss uncertainty. Terms related to uncertainty include subjective risk, which remember is one of the categorizations of risk. Subjective risk, as opposed to objective risk, is the way that you think about risk. And remember, it's different from one person to the next. It affects everyone's individual risk tolerance. So, subjectively, some people might have a high tolerance for risk, while others have a low tolerance for risk. And it also affects your attitude toward risk. If you have a low tolerance for risk, you might have a negative or averse attitude toward risk, whereas those with a high tolerance for risk will tend to be risk aggressive or assertive. And all of this affects how much anxiety is reduced by managing risk, or how much you need to manage risk in order to result in a reduction of anxiety. Then there's possibility and probability. Possibility of loss is not quantifiable. We never know for sure how possible a loss might be. So possibility is not particularly useful in a risk management context. But to measure risk, you must know the probability of an outcome or event occurring. This is the objective side of risk. Uncertainty may be the subjective side of risk, but probability is objective. It's also known as chance, frequency, or likelihood, and it's usually expressed as a percentage. If you'll remember from ARMIN 2005, we often expressed probability or frequency as a percentage, such as 22% probability of loss. And remember that when you multiply the probability times the severity of loss, you get the expected loss. Again, this is measurable or objective risk. Now let's talk about risk classifications. There are 3 major categorizations of risk, beginning with objective versus subjective, where, as we just discussed, objective risk is measurable and subjective risk differs from one person to the other, and it results in uncertainty. Then there's diversifiable versus non-diversifiable risk. In ARMIN 205, we referred to these also as particular versus fundamental risks, where particular or diversifiable risks are those that affect only a small group of people, a family or a company or even an individual, and these can be diversified by spreading the risk among a large group of people. Non-diversifiable or fundamental risks affect a large segment of society at the same time. This includes things like wars and natural disasters like hurricanes and flood, and unemployment. These types of risks cannot be diversified because they affect a large number of people at the same time, so there's no benefit to risk spreading. Then there's pure versus speculative risks. Pure risks, remember, are risks where there is no chance of gain, only a chance of a neutral outcome or negative outcome. With speculative risk, there's a chance of loss, neutral outcome, or gain. Let's look at these pure versus speculative risks a little more closely. This table, which is known as the 4 quadrants of risk, will be very useful throughout the rest of this course. You'll find that we'll refer back to it throughout the course, and it will even help you as you write your risk assessment. On the top are pure risks. Those are hazard risks and operational risks. On the bottom are speculative risks, which include financial risk and strategic risks. Let's look at hazard risks. First, property risks. This is the risk that buildings or personal property like furniture and technology that you own are damaged or destroyed, and it's the cost of replacing and repairing that property in addition to the loss of use. Then there's legal risk, which is also part of hazard risk, liability risk, and the cost of defending yourself in the event of a liability. Then there's personnel risk, the cost associated with an employee getting injured on the job, and consequential risk, which is the risk that another business experiences a type of hazard risk, whether property, legal, or personnel, and that causes a loss to your business. For example, it might be that your largest customer has a property loss, like a fire, and it can't purchase materials from you for a certain period of time, which would cause a loss to your business too. Then there's operational risk, which also falls into the category of pure risk. And we can break that down further into people risk. This is basically the risk that your employees will make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes, and sometimes that can be costly to an organization. Related to people risk is IT risk. In today's modern economy, with businesses so often dependent on the web and other forms of technology, IT risk can be quite significant. Things like cybersecurity, identity theft, and viruses that might affect the information that you store on your systems. Then there's management oversight, which is of course related to other forms of operational risk. Managers should be able to catch problems and prevent loss from occurring, but sometimes they fail to do so. And last, business processes. Business processes can be dramatically different for different types of organizations. For example, for a restaurant, it can be the process of seating the customer, taking their order, preparing the food, getting the food to the customer, and taking the customer's money. For a manufacturer, it's the process of gathering all of the raw materials and putting them together and ultimately making the finished goods, packaging and selling them. As you can imagine, there's numerous ways that mistakes can be made and losses can be incurred by the business throughout this process. Next, let's turn to speculative risks, starting with financial risk. First, market risk. This is basically the risk that consumer demand for your product changes. Obviously, for a business, as demand declines, you sell fewer products or sell your products at a lower price. Then there's credit risk. That is the risk if you sell your product or service on credit. This is the risk that your customers may not be able to pay. Then price risk, which can be related to market risk. And liquidity risk. This is the risk that you take by having assets that are not cash. Remember that liquidity is the ability to turn assets into cash. This can be particularly significant when it's associated with hazard risks. If you have a loss and you need to replace or repair equipment or other assets and you don't have access to cash to do so, you may need to borrow. That brings us to strategic risk. These are risks that are related more to the macro environment. Unemployment and inflation obviously impact your business. The political environment. I think this is an interesting map because it was developed by Aon, which is one of the world's largest insurance brokers. But here we're talking about speculative risk. So this is a good example of how insurance companies and brokers today don't just pay attention to pure risk. They're also very much involved in helping their clients manage their speculative risks. This key, which is a little bit difficult to read, shows the different levels of risk that a client might face if they try to expand their business to different parts of the globe. And it even has symbols illustrating the types of risk that a client might face in different parts of the world. Next, there's demographics. This is what the population is made up of, characteristics of the population, such as age and ethnic or religious background. Obviously, when you think about age, there can be a major shift in demand for your product as the population gets older or younger. And competition. It's always important to consider what the competition is doing, and that can be a major strategic risk for any business. Next, let's discuss financial consequences of risk. We can break financial consequences down into 3 different categories. Expected cost of losses or gains, which is the most obvious financial consequence, expenditures on risk management, and cost of residual uncertainty. Let's talk more about expected cost of losses or gains. Now, of course, we're thinking about the value of assets damaged or destroyed, and the cost of replacing them or repairing them. But we also have to include indirect cost, such as lost work time by an injured employee, loss of use costs for perhaps renting equipment or renting space to operate your business, and also lost profitability. And then there's expenditures on risk management. These can be related to risk control, such as the cost of safety training for your employees and safety equipment, or risk financing, where the most significant cost is usually the cost of insurance. Then there's the cost of residual uncertainty. Let's look more closely at this concept of residual uncertainty. This definition is from the textbook. Residual uncertainty is the level of risk that remains after individuals or organizations implement their risk management plans. It is influenced by their subjective view of risk. So you can see where subjective risk can be very important in terms of the risk management decision process. The cost of residual uncertainty includes things like opportunities foregone. Perhaps you are a very risk-averse individual and you decide not to engage in a business project that might have been profitable. On the other hand, if you do engage in a project that is risky and it ends up being riskier than you even expected, your customers' or consumers' reluctance to engage in unsafe activities or buy unsafe products may result in that project being unprofitable to your organization. Now let's discuss the 3 elements of loss exposures. There is the asset exposed to loss, the cause of loss, and the financial consequences of loss, which we just discussed. So when we think about how we want to approach risk management, we need to be thinking in all 3 of these areas. What assets do we have that are exposed to loss? And this includes anything from our property, our wealth, which is exposed to liability loss and reputation, our human assets, and even our profitability. Then we need to be thinking about causes of loss. We need to consider all the different things that could result in a loss, like not only fire and wind and flood damage, but also theft, riot, civil commotion, and other less common causes of loss. And then there are the financial consequences of loss, which we just discussed. Let's talk quickly about types of exposures. This is a review from Risk Management 2005. In that class, we talked about property, which of course includes the cost of a building or asset and the loss of use, liability, both bodily injury and property damage liability, which is of course the legal liability we incur because of our negligence or strict liability, as well as potential defense costs and other legal costs. And personnel, which is the medical cost and lost wages and lost work time of our employees, and net income or business income. Now let's talk about risk management benefits. The most obvious benefit of risk management is to reduce the financial consequences of risk. In other words, the cost of risk. Let's talk about this one more time. The cost of risk can also be broken down in this way: the cost of losses not reimbursed, the cost of insurance premiums, the cost of external sources of funds. This is if you have a loss and your assets are not liquid and you don't have insurance. You therefore might need to borrow in order to continue business operations. The cost of external sources of funds is generally the interest cost for borrowing in order to pay for losses. The cost of measures to prevent or reduce loss, or the cost of loss control, and the cost of implementing and administering risk management. Other benefits of risk management include preserving financial resources. Think about the concept we discussed in ARMIN 2005, that insurance is the exchange of a small certain sum for a large uncertain sum. Because of this, businesses can actually know what their annual risk management cost is going to be and not have spike losses. This makes budgeting easier for any organization, and it makes an organization a more attractive investment. If you don't have significant fluctuations in payment for a loss, you're a more attractive investment to outside investors. And of course, it reduces anxiety because it increases certainty. You know that the payment of the premium or the payment for other risk management tools will protect you against large fluctuations. And it makes allocation of resources more efficient. The first three here lower the cost of loss, whereas the last two result in less residual uncertainty. Now let's look quickly at the risk management process, and this will also set the stage for the rest of this course. Remember, before we even begin this, that the first step in the risk management process is to identify your objectives. But here, we'll look first at identifying your loss exposures. Second, we'll analyze your loss exposures. This means, remember, looking at the frequency and severity of losses, as well as considering which risks are critical and which are less important or unimportant. Next, we need to examine the feasibility of various risk management techniques, our choices being avoid, retain, control, and transfer. Then we select the appropriate risk management technique. Let's look a little more closely at our choices. Remember that they can be broken up into risk control and risk financing, where risk control includes avoid, which means not engaging in the activity creating the risk at all, and reduce or prevent, where reduction reduces the severity of loss and prevention reduces the frequency or number of times a loss happens. Let's look at some specific examples of risk control. Separation is one which we'll talk about throughout the course. This is separating two assets that are important. Some businesses, for example, require that their officers drive or fly separately to meetings so that if there's an accident, only one of the officers is affected. Then there's duplication, making copies of important documents, for example, or having duplicate items of storage or equipment. A restaurant may, for example, make sure that they have a second refrigeration system. Then diversification. This relates more to speculative risk, market risk, and price risk. For example, let's say that you're a blueberry farmer. You might want to also farm corn and soy, because if the price or demand for blueberries goes down, you can still make money. Now let's look at risk financing. In ARMIN 205, we discussed that retention is a form of risk financing because you either self-insure, pay for things through a self-insured fund, or you pay for things out of cash flows. And then there's transfer, which could include insurance and non-insurance approaches, such as hedging and hold harmless agreements. We'll talk about all of these throughout this course. Next, implementing the selected risk management technique, and lastly, monitoring the results and revising the risk management program as needed. And that's the end of the introduction to risk management.